Hey y'all! Well, we're back for the final episode on our speaker build, and I'm going to go over real quick how I finished these. And I know this seafoam green color may not be everybody's cup of tea, but hey, that's the cool thing about DIY is you can do it however you like and whatever may match your decor. And so, first of all, I sand it down with 220, get all the rough edges off, then come back with 320. And that's really as far as you need to go. You don't need to go below 220 because this is pretty soft material. And then you don't need to really go finer than 320 because the spray bomb paint's fairly thick and will cover those scratches. First thing I do is I come in and spray it with some sandable primer. And I would use a color that is similar to what your finish coat's going to be. This was gray. If you're going to paint them black, I would use black primer, but anyway, you want to use some sandable primer that dries quickly. This stuff dries in about 30 minutes, dry enough to sand. Now, if you are sanding it and you see the paint kind of rolling up, it's not dry enough to sand. It should make dust. So this helps fill in any imperfections. Sand this with 320. May take a couple of coats to get it nice and smooth. Doesn't matter if a little bit shows through. You don't have to get it perfectly covered because we're going to do a two-step paint process. First, I come in with some satin white, give it a nice good coat of this, probably 2 coats. Let this dry 48 hours. Don't try to rush this process. This paint, although it says 24 hours, it really takes about 48 before it really gets hard enough for you to sand it. So we're using this as kind of a build coat, extra primer kind of a coat. Come back with 320 and sand down this white and get the speaker slick. Again, it doesn't matter if you go through on some edges or whatever, but the main thing is you want to use this to fill in any imperfections and get a nice hard surface to put our final coat on. And then come back. Again, I used satin paint. I find it's a lot easier to get a nice looking finish using satin rather than gloss. Gloss shows everything. And especially if you try to paint these gloss black, it's going to show every imperfection. If you wanted to go white, I'd still go satin rather than gloss. And I wouldn't use flat paint. And the reason I have this piece of metal here is I use it. You could use a broomstick or whatever, but you want to make sure it's strong enough where it's not going to break because these speakers are pretty heavy. And I run it through the hole in the speaker kind of diagonally so that I can paint the whole speaker just rolling it because you want to keep the surface that you're painting level to avoid runs. Again, this is pretty thick paint. And you want to I know that people say to put really light coats. If you put really light dust coats, it's going to look like that. The final coat's got to be pretty wet. And if you put this paint on thick enough for it to be wet, it's going to run if you're painting it on a vertical. And so you need to kind of roll the speaker around as you're painting it and get the surface that you're going to be painting level. Spray it. Let it sit. It doesn't take long, maybe a couple of minutes. It'll dry enough where it won't run, and then you can rotate it to the other side and then paint that. You want to paint this thing pretty quick too, so that the overspray doesn't get on the other sides and end up, being like a messy, dusty looking overspray, and that the paint's still soft enough where if any overspray does get on the other surfaces, it'll sink in and end up with a smooth finish. These turned out really nice. And so this is the one we're going to be building today. And so it's all painted. Hope that helps y'all. I'm sure there's plenty of videos on the internet about how to spray bomb stuff good, but that's how I do my stuff. And they usually end up looking pretty good. So anyway, let's get to assembling the speaker. Okay, so the next thing we're going to deal with is get the speaker connector little cups here ready to go. And it comes with these 2-level biamping kind of speaker connectors and or cable connectors, and I have no idea why they're doing that. And so we're just going to use this pair here, and on these ones down here, I just took them out and used some hot glue to fill those in. You could use, whatever you want to fill that in. And I may come back and get a little piece of electrical tape and put it over there. It might look a little neater. I don't know. But anyway, just fill those holes in. So then here's a little trick that I do on the connectors to these lugs. And I'm not going to get into something about, belief that there's ferrous metal nuts and it degrades the sound quality, or that kind of, I think, is nonsense. But I do want to make sure that this connection can't get corroded or get loose or something in the future being on a speaker that's vibrating. So the first thing I do is I come in with my file and file off the ends of these little brass things. Then I come in with a piece of wire, and it doesn't have to be a very long one. And this is just some of the 18 gauge solid core wire I use for everything. And then I bend up a little piece of it so that it can go from the end of that screw over here to the strap, and that it's touching there. And I come in with a really good hot clean soldering iron, and I solder the end of this wire onto the end of the screw like that. Let that cool a second. And then I come up here and solder it to this little tab here. And then let me zoom in here and show you what this looks like. And it's just connected like that. And that way we have a really good solid soldered connection from the center post, which is where your speaker wire is going to connect, and this little tab that's going to go to the crossover. So I'm going to do the other one. This little speaker cup's done, and we're going to start working on the crossover. So here's one crossover completed. I'm going to show you assembling the other one. Here it is in the box. These are the little screw-in, snap-down little tabs that hold the crossover into the bottom of the speaker cabinet, and we'll go over those later. And then here's the board, and we got all of our parts, so we're just going to get all these out. And then jump ahead to getting these things all out of their bags. So we get all our parts laid out like this, and at first I was a little confused on where everything goes, because the bags, it's funny, they label these things, which it's obvious that's where the big one goes and the small one goes. And the capacitors aren't too hard to figure out either. That one's not going to fit there. And then so it's obviously going to go there, and this one's obviously going to go there, but we got these two resistors, and they're the two components the bags weren't labeled. So if you pull up your instruction sheet, it shows you the 1.5 ohm resistor is R2, and the 6.8 one is R1. So let's go ahead and put those in place, because those are the two that you could probably get mixed up if you weren't careful. Now the instructions tell you to glue these components down to the board, and I never like putting resistors right up against a printed circuit board. And not that I think these things are going to get super hot, but they are 10 watt resistors, and so if there wasn't any heat going on inside this thing, they wouldn't have a 10 watt resistor. And so we're going to space them off from the board just slightly so there's an air gap underneath them. So this is the 6.8 ohm one, and it's going to go into the R1 position, which is this first spot right here. So Go through, leave a slight gap on the back side of it, bend the leads over. Those little chokes will hold it up off the tabletop so that it hangs down while you're soldering this. Get a nice cleaned tinned tip and come in and solder this guy in place. That. And then solder this other end in. And you want to make sure you put the tip on the trace on the PC board first so that you make sure it gets good and hot. The lead is easy to solder to, it's so thin, but you want to make sure that you get the heat transferred to the actual trace on the board. And let me zoom in here and show you what I'm talking about. So you want to make sure you're holding the iron like up against that part of the board, and then kind of lead it over into the lead. So next we're going to go ahead and clip these off and straighten that little guy up. You can see we've left a little gap underneath it so the air can circulate under it. It doesn't have to be perfectly even. Nobody's going to ever see it once this thing's inside the speaker, so you don't have to get crazy about having it perfectly level. Unless stuff like that just bothers you. So I try to do it as neat as I can. We'll come in and we'll solder this next guy in. And I wouldn't be real skimpy on the solder. I'd go ahead and put a pretty nice solder joint on this thing, because you don't want this thing to actually come loose in the future or have a crack around the pin because you were skimpy on the solder. So there's that guy. And personally, I usually solder the caps in last because they're the most heat sensitive of any of the devices on this board, or really on any board for that matter. So the next thing I'm going to do is get some contact cement. You want to straighten these leads out like this, and then let's go ahead and make sure that we got everything aligned here. And this thing doesn't have to sit in the very center of that little circle. It doesn't matter. You just want the leads to go through like that. And then we're going to put some contact cement on the bottom of this guy. And I use the cement transfer method where you're just going to go like that, swish a little bit, pull it back apart. If you need to add a little bit, you can add a little bit. And then we're going to put some zip ties on this thing too, but I just like putting a little contact cement on there just so we've got some extra attachment to this and I don't have to worry about these things coming loose, because they are fairly heavy. And as you see, it doesn't matter whether you put it on the choke or the board first. And then you let that set up for just a minute until it gets good and tacky, and then we will touch them together. And then we're solidly glued in place. So here we go. With the big one, we come in with our freshly cleaned tip. Solder that on. Like that. Turn these off. Okay, so you see you got a hole here in the center, and then you got these 2 holes on the outside. And they're perfect for putting some wire ties on this thing. And so, some right here, using these little black ones. And I'm going to go through like this, come up through the bottom, like that. I'm going to have this one right on the edge. It's going to be like that. And then the next one, I'm going to go through like this. So it looks like that. And we're going to end up with a tie down that looks like that. And that's going to securely hold this thing down in addition to the glue. So we don't have to worry about that ever coming loose. And the back side just loops over like that. So let me tie this other side down. Now before this glue on this other one dries up too much, I'm going to go ahead and tack it down in place with the glue. Because the wire ties can wait. But the glue can't. And actually I'm going to wire tie this one down before I solder it just to make sure it stays in place. And if you have longer wire ties, you might be able to just do it with one wire tie on that other side, but I've got these little shorty ones. And they do have to be the smaller size. The larger standard size wire ties will not fit through the holes in the board. And then on the smaller one, we just do it like this. So it looks like that. So we got them both wire tied down in place. Come back in and solder this choke in place. And all we have left are the 2 capacitors. We'll be done with the crossover. It's a pretty simple little part. And it's a good introduction to like PC boards type soldering if you've never done it before. There we go. Cut those off. Then, like I said, what we got left are the 2 capacitors. And the 8UF one is C2, so it goes right here. And just like the resistors, I don't like putting them just right up against the board. So then we got this one. And if you want to like populate the board and then come back in and solder them all at once, it might be a little quicker, but I'm not in a big hurry. And there we go with that cap. And then we've got this one 6.8 UF that is C1. And the other thing I always like doing, and obviously for function, it doesn't matter, but I always like rotating the capacitor so that the lettering is up so that you can read it. And I always put them in the same direction like this so it's easy to read the value. So, again, stand it up just a couple of centimeters or so, or a few millimeters rather, off of the board. And I never understood why the US never converted to the metric system. I mean, they tried when I was a kid. People just got too confused, and it was like, really, it's not that complicated. And doing calculations and just working with metric numbers is so much easier than fractions and thousandths of an inch and all of that mess. But I guess they just couldn't get the country to convert, which is a shame. Anyway, and there we go. Crossover's all done. So these two terminals here are the plus and minus for the input, and then over on this side, it's got the woofer output, the tweeter output all labeled. So we'll just need to cut some length of wire that are appropriate and solder those on and get ready to put this thing inside the speaker cabinet. And here we have the crossover with the wires soldered to them. Main thing you want to make sure is that you have the red stripe on the plus and the non-red stripe on the minus, so you get the polarity on everything correct. And we've done the same with our tweeter. The reason these two ended up being the same length is I'm decided to put it with the big choke to the back of the cabinet. And so the woofer is going to come up here to the front, and then this one's going to come up here high to the top. And then I went ahead and soldered this speaker jack connector pocket thing onto this. I'm going to stick the crossover in through the back of the speaker, and then it attaches to the inside of the cabinet with these little guys that are threaded on one end and have a little pin with a snap connector on it. And these thread into the bottom of the cabinet. There's some little metal inserts in there. It also comes with some inserts. If they didn't pre-install them, you need to do that probably before you assemble the cabinet. But if you didn't, you should still be able to reach in there and do that. And then it comes with some double stick tape foam pieces that I'm going to cut and put one on each end when I snap this in. And then again, this is going to go up the tweeter up high, and then this other one's going to go to the woofer out the front. And got plenty of lead here. I may shorten these up a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and install these things into the speaker cabinet, and then we'll be ready to put the insulation in and install the speakers, and we'll be done. And one other little trick I use, and this isn't obviously entirely necessary, but if you happen to have one, this isn't a bad idea, where these wires come into this board, come in with a hot glue gun and just fill in around these wires to give them a little extra support. And I'm not going to show you in detail doing all this, but anyway, this is just a little tip on helping make sure these wires don't ever pull out of the board. And when you get done, it'll look like that. It just gives a little extra kind of, support to the wires when they come out of the board. And once you let this cool off, any flexing that's going to happen is going to be up here in the flexible part of the wire, and it's not going to be here where the solder joint was. So anyway, just a little pro tip there. Okay, so I've put these white stuffing stuff all inside the box, and I used some contact cement to hold it in the places that I think it needed to be held. And I need to make sure this isn't going to get into the woofer, this little part right here. If it is, I'll just trim that out. But as you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but there's the base port. And you want to make sure that you keep this stuff glued to the sides so that it doesn't fall down and cover up the base port. And you want it to open up the center like that so the air can move around inside the cabinet. I got the tweeter wire pulled up here, and so I think we're ready to solder the tweeter in place and then solder the woofer in place, and we'll be done. So I'm going to come up here and tin these leads just like this. And if you wanted to, you could put some spade terminals on here so the speakers could plug in and, unplug them if you want to. But I'm just going to direct solder them onto the tweeter. And I'm actually going to put a little solder onto these terminals as well, so they're all ready to just heat up and solder the wires right onto the tweeter itself, like that. And as you can see, I put a little piece of that stuff on the back of the tweeter just, I guess, for fun, right? So that's our positive lead, and that's our positive wire. So we're going to solder that one on, solder this side on. And set the tweeter down in its little hole. Just like that. And I'm going to get the screws and then screw these down, and then we'll come back and show you soldering in the woofer and bolting it down, and we're completely done then with the speaker, and we can go see what this sounds like. So all we have left to do is hook up the 2 wires from the woofer part of the crossover up to the woofer and slide it in place. I tacked this little gasket on with a little contact cement in a few places just so it'll stay in place while we're trying to put this in. So let's tack these couple of wires up and put this woofer on. Soldered in nice and good. And I cut these little side pieces off here because you really don't need them for this installation. And then we just roll this guy into place. Like that. And put our screws in, and we are done. Let me show you what the front of it looks like. And here's what it's going to look like. Actually, the lettering is in this direction. The lettering would be upside down if I put it in this way. So I'm gonna, I think I got plenty of wire. Yep. Okay. Put it this way. Not that it makes any difference, but that way their little lettering on that speaker cone's in the right direction. So let me pop these screws in, and these things will be all ready to go. Listening to this one, I still have to paint the other cabinet and let it dry. Well, here we are. We're all done. And again, this one's in paint. This one's finished. I need to let this dry. I just painted this one today. It's only a few hours. I don't even want to touch it because it takes a little while for that paint to really kick. And you really want to give these things about 48 hours after you paint them before you start like trying to assemble them, because you'll end up with fingerprints in the paint. The paint's pretty soft until it's been drying for about 48 hours, no matter what the can says. So just a word of warning on that. I haven't listened to these yet. I want to wait until I get both of them done because I want to listen to the pair. Also want to let them break in for probably a week or so before I start, making any kind of determination on what they sound like. The speakers do need to break in, especially the woofers, that not really the foam around the outside of the cone, but the part there by the voice coil needs to get loosened up some. And so any brand new speakers like that, they just sound kind of tight. So anyway, I'm going to let them break in, let y'all know what I think they sound like. They turned out really nice. They're really about the size of my RP600Ms. They're maybe a little shorter, but they're the same width and same depth. And I'm hoping, given that these are a fairly deep cabinet being bass ported, that they're going to have some decent bass. And they should sound really nice. But that's for a future video. This was a fun project. I've got another pair of DIY speakers that we'll do in the future. Probably going to wait a little while. They've got 2 woofers and a single soft dome tweeter. And they're a little taller. They're probably about like this. And so that'll be another fun project for another day. So hope you're enjoying this content. If you are, please subscribe to my channel. Please like the video. And we'll be back soon for some future tube amp fun. And until then, have a great day.